I am here to introduce Karin Hellman and Tira Schwartz. They are both on our user experience team. Karin is a designer and Tira is our researcher. They are going to take it away from here, but please feel free to ask questions along the way. I'm going to say that for you both. And we will have time for questions at the end as well. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Today we're going to go through a bunch of different things, but really the main focus is how to create great user experiences. So I'm just quickly going to walk you through the agenda here. And what we're going to do is that we're going to start by introducing the user experience and design team. Then we're going to look at a little bit how do we define UX and what is it that we're talking about when we say those two letters. Then I'm going to dig pretty deep into the design process. What do we actually do when we create these experiences and what are the things that we are focusing on? And then it's exciting because Tira is going to share some research insights with you that she's gotten over the past 6 months or so. She's done a lot of studies with both customers but also constituents, and she's going to share a little bit of that. And then we'll wrap up with some ways for you guys all to get involved and to get more deeply into how you can do things to make the experiences at Socrata better. So, starting off with the UX and design team at Socrata. We right now have 6 people working full-time only on creating user experiences. And we have 4 user experience designers, 1 researcher, and a graphics designer. And I did a little poll the other day just to get some team-wide information. And it turns out that we've studied higher education in 3 countries together. We speak 7 languages. And we have a total of 15 years of Socrata experience altogether. So that's a little bit of a UX team. And now Tira is going to tell you more about what UX is and how we define it.
Great. Thanks, Karin. As a user experience team, we have 3 primary goals, and that's to make experiences usable, useful, and engaging. And I'm going to dive into what those mean a little bit. So to begin, when a product is useful, it's solving a problem for its users. If it's not actually meeting any needs, then no users are ever going to really use it. When a product is usable, it means that our users are successful in using it. And success can be broken down into lots of different metrics, but some of the more prevalent ones are being discoverable, learnable, and achievable. And then finally, engaging. So engaging is really another way of saying how do people feel when they use this product. It's really important to understand what kind of value people receive from the experience, aside from just that functional value. And so some of the examples that I've provided here, we might hear people say things like, it's pleasant, or maybe it's even delightful. And in productivity scenarios, they might say that it's rewarding. So I'm going to hand it back to Karin.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so let's dig into this design process a little bit. Something that's important to know is when you're designing for a problem, it's very rarely a straight path from problem to solution. More likely, it looks something like this. And while you can think that having to try again and having to try multiple times is actually a failure, I think we should look at it as a success. It's a success because it means that we're willing to take feedback, we're willing to improve, and we're willing to not settle with what's good enough. So knowing this, that we want to and encourage trying many times to do and create something that's really good, we can actually be a little bit smart about when we try things. So if you look at this graph, and it has sort of the normal timeline of a project or feature that's being developed. And then you plot the cost of making changes during this project, you can see that it increases almost exponentially for every phase in the project. So let me give you an example of how we use this. We know that when we did the very first version of Open Budget, we went to our design partner in Montgomery County, and we showed them sketches on paper. So we were somewhere around here. And when we had the conversation that allowed us to identify holes and issues in these designs, it didn't cost us more than bringing out a new piece of paper to change it. Had we instead come to them with a fully engineered product, that spent engineers and took them weeks to write, then we would have probably identified the same issues, but we would have had to spend a lot more money fixing it. So finding the sweet spot of making changes where it costs you the least to make them is really important in this iterative development. So now it might start to sound like we're doing this waterfall-like development where we never touch things again after we've released them to production, and that's not really true either. What we do is we do more iterative design. So if you think about that straight line that I was showing a minute ago, it actually looks a little bit more like this. It's a circle, and then there are faces that keep coming back, and we keep improving. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what these different phases are and what they stand for and what we do during them. So the first phase is some sort of research phase. It can be either an initial analysis at the beginning of the project, or it could be sort of an evaluation once you're done and you want to test something. The second thing you do is typically the heart of the design phase, and this is where we take ideas and problems and we turn them into solutions. And then we have the execution phase, which is really when the solutions turn into real features and products. So digging into each one of these phases a little bit more. During the initial analysis phase, there are two questions that are really important to answer. You want to know what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and who are you solving it for? Because like Tira said earlier, if we're not solving a problem for a real person, then we're not creating a useful product. Nobody's going to use it, and it's not worth our time. So an example that I have from recent things that we've been doing is that we were looking at our Google Analytics data for Data Lens. And we saw that the usage of mobile or Data Lens on mobile devices had really skyrocketed over the past couple of months. So this meant to us that this is a really valuable problem that we haven't prioritized yet, but now that we can see the data backing it up, we're going to do it sooner rather than later. So that's great. So we've identified and we've prioritized the problem. Then we need to figure out who are we actually solving the problem for. So we're hypothesizing that we're probably not looking at a typical developer scenario. People aren't really accessing the API on their phone. We also know from lots of interviews that we've done with publishers and customers that the typical publisher tasks are typically done at a desktop computer at work. So that's not really the scenario that we're looking at either. So what we ended up with here is that we more likely have a citizen, potentially a consumer type experience, where someone is trying to answer a question while being on the go. And what kind of question that could be, Tara is going to tell you a little bit more about in a second. Okay, we figured out what is the problem, who are we solving it for. The next thing we do is we go into the design phase. So this is where we take the very useful thing we're doing and we're trying to make it as usable as possible. So during the very first sort of ideation phase, we really try to get as many ideas on paper as possible, because then we can throw out anything that's not really usable. So in this case, designing for mobile is actually a really hard problem to solve. Not only do you have 80% less screen real estate, you also have to make things bigger in order to be able to tap them, and you have to surface more information because you can't rely on things appearing on hover, for example. So you have more things, bigger things, and less space. So that's a problem in itself. And then we're also dealing with the problems of the mobile web as opposed to a native mobile product. So knowing all of these things, we can, using only pen and paper, go through that try again loop probably 50 times within an hour in order to scratch anything that's not viable and move forward with only the best ideas that we have. So moving forward, knowing, okay, so this is what kind of works and what doesn't work, we've already gotten some feedback within the team, it's probably time to create an overall design. So this is typically called an information architecture or a wireframe, a mock-up, screen flows. You can call it whatever you want. Basically, it's a diagram that shows the application as a whole. And what's really good about this is that this allows you to walk through the most common user scenarios and make sure that you're not missing anything fundamental. In this particular case, we were looking at the desktop version of Data Lens and then going to a mobile version. Are we covering all the features that we want to cover? Are we translating them in a way that actually makes sense for these new scenarios that we have on a mobile phone? So this is sort of to cover all of our bases, and also good for communicating to other people what is the structure of the thing that we're building. So after that, we might go build a prototype. And prototypes are, in our case, it's great because it allows us both to test things, but also to communicate things. So having something that's interactive that you can play with, that goes from screen to screen and shows the application flow, is a really efficient way of communicating what you're trying to accomplish. And it's still way low on that scale of cost of changing things. So this prototype, for example, for data lens, I don't think I spent more than 15 minutes making it the first time I used a tool called Envision. So I bet anyone in this room can go use the Envision app and create a prototype in less than an hour. Another favorite tool of mine is called POP, Prototyping on Paper. That's an iPhone app. And you literally take pictures of your screens that you've drawn on paper, and then you can link them together in the app and get an interactive thing that you can play with. So that's something that I really recommend. It doesn't have to be hard to create prototypes. So the next time you're trying to communicate an idea or want to try something out, try creating an interactive prototype and see how that goes for you. Okay, so we have sort of the structural things figured out. We know what we're trying to make and how it's flowing together. Now we're going to touch really deeply on the engagement part that Tira was mentioning. So visual design is a great way of making people feel things. And for data lens, we didn't really want to leave it up to our gut feel, what felt good about colors and type fonts and so forth. So we actually did a large-scale survey where we had 4 pretty different visual designs that we sent out to people, and then we had to have them rate each design based on how well they thought that it agreed with a certain adjective. So based on these adjectives, we can then say, okay, so is this design actually making people feel the way we want them to feel? So this has a lot to do with the engagement aspect. There are, of course, other things that affect how you feel when you use a product. It's things like, is this product behaving the way I want it to behave? Is it predictable? Is it performant? Is it fast enough? And is it full of bugs? Is it breaking when I'm trying to use it? That's also something that's really affecting your experience. So that actually brings me to the next part, which is the execution phase. So forth, our engineers, they've been with us all this way. They've been looking at our wireframes. They've been playing with our prototypes. They're totally bought into who we're trying to solve this problem for and what the problem is. So this is their time to shine and go say, let's do it. So it's not like it ends here. We don't stop as designers to work with the engineers. We don't throw things over the wall and say, hey, go engineer this, and we'll get it back when it's done. That's just not how it works. So this is when the real back and forth begins. We actually internally even have a phase that we call the Pong phase. And I sit really closely to all of the engineers that I'm working with, and we talk many times a day. So like to give you hello? There we go. It's the Pong phase. And to give you an example of what a typical Pong discussion could look like, it could be something like this. Engineer comes to me, says, hey, what should we do with this map when we have something that's clicked and this information that's showing we want to zoom the map, then what happens? And I would typically refer to some sort of design pattern that we have, either internally at Socrata or that some other thought-leading product is using. So in this case, I told them that, okay, well, let's do what Google Maps does, because that's an established pattern within this problem. Another kind of question that is typically asked is, okay, so what do we do when this chart that we're looking at, all the data that's backing it up, it gets deleted? And that's the typical type of edge case that engineers are great at digging up. And as we've iterated over and over again, we can't know everything up front, so we have to try and try again, right? So my answer here would be, okay, we don't know this answer right now, but let's take it back. Let's spend the time it deserves to figure out the right behavior, and let's revisit it and implement something that works. So all this back and forth, it eventually leads us to something that we can release. And as soon as we release it into production, we go right back and we evaluate. I fully intend to go look over someone's shoulder that's using the mobile version of Data Lens as soon as it gets out, because that's how we get back into this loop. I'm going to look over someone's shoulder and I'm going to see things that I need to fix. We need more ideas, more design, more execution, and we go round and round in this loop until eventually we reach success. So that's the design process part of things. And now Tira is going to show a little bit of research. Oh yeah, by the way, if you haven't seen this out there, this is actually a lot more examples of this exact process that we've done. And the products that you use every day is going to be part of there, and you can see sort of exactly what we've done to go through every step of this process. It's also a great place to stop and talk more with us and ask more questions. And there, I'm going to hand it off to you for more research results.
Okay, so before I begin to talk about some of the actual research results that we've gotten recently, I'm actually going to just briefly talk about what user experience research is. So the way I think about it is that every user experience research project is going to begin with a research question, and that question might have a hypothesis. We're going to apply some sort of formal methodology in order to answer that question. And then we also do some analysis to answer the question. And that analysis tends to be more of the qualitative format because it's often qualitative research. So things like coding and theming are things that come up often in my research. So diving in, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is actually mapping back to those research questions. In order to know that an experience is useful, we need to understand what problem we're solving. So what we did was we started with talking to over 120 constituents, so they were citizens, and we wanted to find out what kinds of questions do they have about public services. And specifically, we asked them to think about a question they had about a public service for which they actually went and pursued an answer to. So this wasn't just a made-up question that they had. They actually went and pursued the answer to it. And so with the 120 responses, we then went and coded these responses. And it turned out that every single one of these questions could map back into 5 distinct categories. And so I'm going to walk through those categories with you. So the first one, this probably isn't surprising, and it made up the bulk of the responses within these categories, was tell me a rate or state. And an example here is which schools showed the best performance. And this question came to us from a teacher from West Virginia. So once a citizen asks, tell me, a rate or a state, the next follow-up logical question to it is why? Why is that rate or state the way it is? So for example, why was there an increase in taxes? And that came to us from a small business owner in Ohio. Great question. The next category, help me understand this service. So this is actually taking a step back. A lot of people just don't understand the way a lot of the public services work. So they just want these overarching questions answered. So the example that we have here is who makes up public health policies? And that also came from a small business owner from New York. The next 2 categories of questions, I like to call them the so what categories. So the first one is, now that I understand that rate or state, what are you guys doing about it? So tell me about an initiative. The example here, which is one of the most common questions that we hear from citizens, is what is being done to lower crime? And this came from a student in California. And then the final category is tell me about an opportunity. And this is actually my favorite category. I love talking about it because there's some really interesting things that are happening. People are not only asking to how they can take part in a public service. So the example here was where are school lunches being administered for kids over the summer. Our conversations with the citizens was this past summer. So not only are they asking, how do I take part in these services, or how do I help other people take part in these services, but then how do I also contribute back to these services? So we heard things like, where can I go volunteer this weekend? Or I'm part of a women's organization and we wanted to know what kind of funding the library got recently so that we can actually help bridge that gap. Really great questions. So what I love about this research, there's a couple things. One is that you could imagine that this is actually your architectural framework for any kind of public-facing website in terms of the way citizens think about the work that public services organizations do. Another thing is that it reminds us it's not just about the numbers. I think in the world of open data and being someone who loves data myself, I think it's really easy to get lost in the numbers, and really the numbers make up a pretty small percentage of these types of questions. These questions are much more well-rounded and much more holistic. So you might wonder then, how many of these questions can actually be addressed with open data? There's not a one-to-one mapping here, surprisingly. So that was the next question that we investigated. And so it turns out that the vast majority of questions can be answered with data or with data and some sort of supplement. So it turned out that about half of the questions that all the citizens had, data and data alone could actually answer that question. And when I say data, I specifically mean it could be a number, but it could also be a visualization, a map, sometimes even a calendar, especially for those opportunities that people want to take part in. And the example here is, what is the most common type of crime in my city? Really all you need is a visualization. You can answer that. But then for 35% of the questions that we heard from our citizens, if all you gave was data, their question would not be answered. You actually needed some sort of narrative, and as we're hearing as a common theme, you need some sort of storytelling in order to answer that question. So an example there was from our actual survey, what are the pros and cons of consumer recycling in New York City? Great question, but if you just show a bunch of pictures, you're never really going to answer that person's question. And then a pretty small percentage, I called it just no need for data. I don't even really believe that. I think there's always a need for data. But in this case, data probably wouldn't be the best way to answer the question. And these tended to be more of the tactical types of questions, like where do I get this form, which happens, as you all probably know, quite frequently. All right, so this is some of the research that helps us understand what problems we're solving and how open data can address those problems. The next part of the research that I'm going to share is about, are people successful? And so what we did here was we were focusing, this was a usability study, and we were focusing specifically on data lens and some more of the traditional views, the tabular view that we have in our product. And we were asking citizens to try out tasks. And we began, we had 60 citizens fill out or complete this usability study. And we had them complete tasks that were based on the questions we heard from the previous research. People weren't asking what is the exact number of crimes committed. They were saying things like, am I safe? Or what neighborhoods am I safer in? Or is crime going up and down? So those were the types of questions that we asked in this particular study. So diving into it, the first question, what's the most common type of crime in my city? And when we asked citizens to use a data lens to answer that question, 95% of the citizens were successful using what I'm calling a simple data lens, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. We asked a similar set of citizens to try it out using the tabular view, and not one person was able to answer that specific question in under 5 minutes. Another example of a task was what neighborhood had the least amount of crime due to drugs? And you'll see that the rate went down here with 75%. And the reason for that is that right now the way we've designed a data lens is each category has its own visualization. There's multiple visualizations. And a lot of citizens, when you ask them a question about a neighborhood, they just go straight to the map. And then what happens is that they don't see a way to filter directly on that map. And so this is just good fodder for conversations that we have in the design team with research about, okay, well, what are the pros and cons of having this type of design, and how do we want to think about this in the future? Good stuff. We don't have a perfect answer yet, but we're certainly working on it. And by the way, the 75% success, it was in under 2 minutes. And then similar number here, none of the citizens were able to answer this more complex question in under 5 minutes. So if you're a data publisher, you might be thinking a couple things right now. You might be thinking, but wait, these are just average citizens. Of course, they can't use a tabular view that's much more complex, and visualizations are several clicks away. And that is correct. And you might also be thinking that citizens don't have a ton of data literacy, and so we wouldn't expect them to be proficient, and that is also correct. You might also be thinking that maybe most of your users are actually data analysts or are developers. And so an interesting piece of research, it's not fully complete yet, but we recently had 5 cities and counties participate in an intercept study. And most of you have probably been on a website and you've gotten a little pop-up, sometimes kind of annoying, and it says, do you want to participate in our study? So you can thank me and people like me for those kinds of things. So we recently had an intercept study across 5 of our cities and counties, and we had over 470 people identify themselves in what roles they were. And it turned out that about a quarter identified as either a data analyst or a developer. A very small percentage were internal users, and the rest are basically citizens. They're people looking for their lost dog. They're people looking for new homes. They're students doing research. And it's just fascinating. A lot of them have very little data literacy. But let's say we were actually targeting a data analyst or a developer. I actually asked a bunch of data analysts and developers at Socrata to answer this question using the tool of their choice, but not a data lens. So what do you all think happened? It took them 10 times longer because they were writing scripts, and that takes longer than just a minute and a half of exploring a data lens. And not only that, I didn't include the time it takes to download the data, and the bigger the data set, the longer it takes. It's just natural. And so if you include the amount of time it took to download, it was actually 50 times longer. And then, like many data analysts, we went back and forth on the validity of my question and then the validity of the data. And if you factored that in, we were talking something like 100 times as long as the average citizen. Okay. So as a data publisher, you might be asking yourself, is there something that I can do? Is there something that I can take away from the insights in order to make this a better experience for my end users? And the answer is yes, that's why we're here. We want to share some of those insights with you. So recall I mentioned that these results were specifically for a simpler data lens. As part of the study, we used both the city's default data lenses that they had published, which had about 10 or 12 cards. And the reason for that was also because of some of the design work that we did of what the default experience would look like. We thought more data is better, more visualizations is better. And it turns out that when we compared the results of users using that default lens to a custom, simpler data lens that we created that had only 4 visualizations in it, there was a 25% difference in the success rates. That's huge. Going back to those numbers that I talked about, where it was 95% success, that turned to 70% success just for that basic question. And then for 75% success for that more complex question, the results then became 50% success. So we went from pretty awesome results to pretty abysmal results really quickly just with one factor, the simplicity and the number of cards. So just please, 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 if there's one thing that you're going to do, it's to focus on what you think are the most important questions that your citizens have about the data and just be as minimalist as possible. If they need the full data set, they can get it. So just help them be successful. Another thing that can help them be successful goes back to what is the most common complaint, question, issue that our end users have when they work with open data, which is that they don't understand what the data is about. And that can happen at multiple levels. That might happen at the cell level, where they don't understand the value. That might happen at the categorical level. They don't understand what the group is about or the category is about. Or it could happen at the entire data set level. So for example, in a recent study, 20% of the participants just had no idea what 311 data is. Something that seems pretty obvious to all of us that work with that information all the time. We forget that this just isn't common knowledge to most citizens. So in addition to keeping it simple, make sure, and I know this isn't the easiest task, that the data is clean and meaningful and descriptive so that people can understand how to use it. We have the saying in user research, it's sort of like if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? If a feature isn't discoverable, does it even exist? And I think in open data, the analogy there is that if the data isn't meaningful, what was the point of publishing it? So at this point, we've talked about what are the problems we're solving, are people successful, and now we're going to dive into a little bit of the engagement. And so before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit about how I think about measuring engagement. It's not an easy thing to do, to ask someone how they feel. A lot of the times, people don't even think about it, they're just feeling, they're not thinking. And there's questions just about like the validity of asking people about visceral questions and testing for those things. And so the thing that I like to focus on when I'm doing this type of research is to understand what those triggers are for making people feel the way they feel. And oftentimes that's really just about what successes that they're gaining, what value are they gaining, aside from just the functional. And so we recently did a survey with about 50 customers, and we asked our customers what kind of success stories that they could describe with their experiences with open data. And they could have up to 3 responses. And while we were at it, we also asked them to tell us a little bit about what their organizational goals were. And there were a couple reasons to do that, but one in particular is that a lot of time those visceral reactions of feeling pleased or even delighted really has to do with what your expectations are. So if your expectations are just being met, great, things are good. If they're exceeding, ooh, that could be an opportunity for delight. And if they're not at all being met, okay, we've got a problem. We need to fix that. And so how do you understand what people's expectations are? Well, I asked them what their organizational goals were, and specifically to prioritize those organizational goals. So let's go into that. So on the left there, you'll see a list of the organizational goals prioritized from top to bottom by 50 of our customers. And you'll see at the top, it says supporting data-driven decisions. Probably not a big surprise to this group. After that comes increasing operational efficiency. Probably also not a surprise. Increasing transparency is the next one. And then the following 3 are all about having impact with citizens. Wonderful, lovely list, great. Okay, so what do you think happened when we asked people to tell us success stories? Did we see the same list? Was it in a different order? All right, suspense. Okay, so the first thing that I want to point out that might not be obvious is the top 4 organizational goals map to the top 4 success stories. That's awesome. I feel so proud. But there are 2 differences that I want to briefly talk about. So one is that while supporting data-driven decisions was the top organizational goal, it was not the top success story. Okay? There's a couple reasons that this is probably happening that I want to talk about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well if you have any ideas after we have some discussion about this. One is that if you're publishing the data, in order for you to know if any kind of decisions are being made about it, you need a really great feedback loop. And right now the feedback loop is basically downloads or, view count. That's a proxy, but it's not a great proxy. And this presents itself as a huge opportunity for us to help improve that experience. There are many other ways that we would be able to measure what's happening to that data along that path. And wouldn't it be great if publishers had access to those insights? The second thing, though, is that I'm not really sure data-driven decision-making makes a great story. This may be controversial. But I think of data-driven decision-making as a means to an end. And the end is what's important here. We make data-driven decisions in order to save money, in order to save time, in order to enhance the lives of citizens. So if I'm asking people to tell me how this has impacted their lives, they're going to tell me those stories with that end goal in mind. They're not talking as much about the process. While the process is important, it just doesn't tell as great of a story. The second shift that I want to talk about is increasing operational efficiency. Small bump, it was second in our list of prioritized goals, but it was top of the list for success stories. But what you might notice is the count. It was more than twice as frequently cited in terms of success stories. And I thought that was really interesting because we do talk about increasing operational efficiency as one of our 3 business goals, but I don't think we've really internalized how valuable it is and how much success is happening there. And I think it's truly a reason for us to be excited and to celebrate. So we've done sort of the story of, are we solving problems for users? Are they successful? And are they finding value beyond just the functional? And from here, Karin is going to give us some more details on how we can continue some of these conversations.
Cool. Thank you. I'm literally just wrapping up here. So if there's Any questions that you have that are not going to be answered in the little Q&A that we're going to have in about a minute, feel free to email them to us. We have business cards over here, so come grab one and then shoot us a question whenever you're thinking about anything. Second, stop by the UX booth that we have out there in the lobby. We are super happy to talk to all of you. We love talking to customers. That's how we make things better. So we have both that process wall that's showing you more examples of things that we've created and how we created them. But we also have a persona wall, which presents our personas, meaning sort of the archetypes of users that we have. But you can also create your own personas if you have something that's missing. And lastly is to partner with us. We do both usability studies with customers on a frequent basis. We send surveys that are super helpful if we get more responses for. And we actually want to do more participatory design so we can sit down together and figure things out and make them better. So we really like talking to you guys, and we are hoping that you will talk to us more, because that will make all of the Socrata experiences a lot better. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Thank you.
I'll ask one. Maybe for organizations that don't have the benefit of having a incredibly talented UX team, what are some guerrilla tactics that if they want to understand their users better, what can they do with what they have to understand them and hopefully serve them better?
Sure. So my favorite thing is to catch people when they have a spare moment and ask them questions, people who you think might be more representative of your end users than the person sitting next to you every day. In Seattle, that place is a ferry boat. You're stuck. You can't, oh, yeah. Yeah, so in Seattle, we talk about getting people onto ferry boats or like waiting in line for buses and just saying, hey, do you have a minute while you're waiting? I have a couple questions for you. Can you take a look at this? And getting that feedback that way. Do you want to?
Yeah, I can just add one thing is that don't be afraid to show people things. Even if you have just some squares on a paper, that's still going to be more useful than if you go develop something that's completely wrong. So don't be afraid to get that early feedback.
Yeah.
All your surveys and questions and results, are those available for constituent users to leverage in building our experiences?
Yes. So I have not published them yet, but they will be published, yeah.
What was this question?
Are the responses from our research and the data from our research, is that going to be published?
You're talking about those like 5 questions that you went out and did research.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, any research that we do, pretty much, we're going to be publishing it. Any other question? Okay, thanks.
That's good.